Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our American Center Tashkent virtual chat class. My name is Gulshan, and I'm very happy to meet everyone and greet everyone here. And I'm very excited today because we have a special guest today, Dr. Jay Turner. Hello, Dr. Turner, how are you?
I am well. Great to see you, Gulshan.
Great to see you too, and thanks so much for your time. Thanks for taking the offer to do this chat for us today.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to give a short background about you to everyone. Dr. Jay Turner is the Vice Dean for Education and James McKelvey Professor of Engineering Education at Washington University in St. Louis, where he is also a professor of energy, environmental, and chemical engineering. His research primarily focuses on technical analysis to support air quality planning and management, and field studies to qualify human exposures to air pollution. His current work includes projects in St. Louis, USA, Louisville, USA, and South Africa and Mongolia. Jay also holds a visiting scholar position at Harvard University and serves on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Science Advisory Board. And it's a great pleasure because it's Air Quality Week, and it's the best time to hear from you, Dr. Turner. I also want to remind everyone that, as usual, please don't be shy and put your questions and comments in the comment section under this video, both on YouTube and Facebook. And Dr. Turner will try to answer them at the end after the presentation. So thanks so much, Jay, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Gulshan, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon. As Gulshan mentioned, this is Global Air Quality Awareness Week, and so it's fitting that we would be having a conversation today about air quality. And we'll be discussing air quality with a specific focus on Central Asia, and we'll also look at it in a broader global context. First, let's think about the different types of air pollution that we experience at ground level. That is, we'll be concerned today with the air pollution that you and I breathe. There's particles in the air, and often you see these particles such as the exhaust plume coming out of a dirty diesel vehicle, or from a chimney if you're burning wood or another type of solid fuel in a home. There's also many gas pollutants that we're exposed to. So of course we don't see them because they're gases, but they can impact human health also. The most common ones are listed here, and what we're going to be focusing on today, though, is the particulate matter aspect of air pollution. With regard to these different pollutants, different organizations around the world have standards or guidelines. And I list here in one column the US Environmental Protection Agency standards. So for these 6 pollutants, we have standards in the United States where we routinely measure the air pollution in cities across the country to determine whether or not they are in compliance with our standards. The World Health Organization has air quality guidelines, or AQGs. These are accepted globally as targets that should be achieved to meet air quality. However, they don't have the same force as a law because they're from the World Health Organization and not from a specific country government. However, again, these World Health Organization guidelines are very important because it's what most countries use as an aspirational goal or a benchmark for air quality. We're going to be focusing our discussion today on Central Asia with specific examples from Tashkent. In the bottom right, I'm showing a figure that shows ozone air pollution. And again, we're going to focus on particles today, but I did want to show one figure of ozone air pollution. And this is showing the concentrations of ozone at ground level, and this can cause issues with your respiratory system, like the frequency and severity of asthma events or asthma attacks. And we see the data here by month for last year in Tashkent. And this is typical throughout all of Central Asia. We see that the ground level ozone is worse in the summertime. That's when you're most susceptible to having adverse health effects from this pollutant. So right now we're in early May, and so we can actually expect that over the next few months in Tashkent and in other Central Asian cities, you're going to be in the worst period for your ozone air pollution. If you're interested during the question and answer time, we can chat about why it has such strong seasonality. But let's focus on particles. The particles in the air that we breathe, we're most interested in the particles that are too small for you to see with your eyes. They're too small to even see with that optical microscope that you might use in a high school chemistry course or biology course. In this case, we have to use scanning electron microscopy to see these really small particles. And so these particles that I'm showing in these three different images, these are particles that are about 1/200th the width of a human hair. So again, 1/200th the width of a human hair. They can have irregular shapes like the top right. Interestingly, they can have perfectly spherical shapes like the bottom right. And one of my favorite images is on the left. Here you have soot particles from combustion, those little black circles, but then they have a coating on the outside because of chemistry that took place in the atmosphere and added a coating to the outside of the particles. So the particles are really complex in terms of size and shape and composition, but this is all in the air that we breathe. Now, we're going to talk about particles that are smaller than 2.5 micrometers in size, and a micrometer is 10 to the minus 6 meters. For today's discussion, we're not going to be too concerned about that detail, other than just the point that these particles are again about 1/200th the width of a human hair in their size, and as we'll see in a moment, they can get deep into your lungs. We also commonly talk about particles smaller than 10 micrometers. And those particles that include both PM2.5 and PM10, what we'll see is the small particles are mostly from man-made sources like combustion. The larger particles are mostly from resuspended dust. And so in Central Asia, especially in southern Central Asia, you also have large dust impacts from the dry desert regions. So both PM2.5 and PM10 are a concern in Central Asia. Now, we're not going to worry about the words that are on this slide. Just focus on the picture. And what happens is we breathe in air, and some of those particles, like the larger particles, they deposit in the upper part of your respiratory system. But these really small particles, those smaller than 2.5 microns, again, we just call it PM2.5, they can get deep into your lung, into the region where you're actually exchanging air, oxygen with the bloodstream that then circulates throughout the body. So what can happen is these particles can deposit in your lung and they can affect your respiratory system. They can also deposit in your lung and dissolve and move into your bloodstream and spread throughout your entire body. So that's the interesting thing about these small particles. It's not just an effect on your lung, it's an effect on all of the organs in your body. And if we look at how we've learned about air pollution health effects over time, we first learned about the lower left many, many decades ago, about the effect of air pollution on our lungs and our respiratory system. Several decades ago, the research taught us a lot about the effect of air pollution on your cardiovascular system, that would be your heart, and the other related systems. More recently, the research is teaching us about air pollution particulate matter impacts on your neurological system, like your brain. And indeed, one project I'm working on is whether certain types of air pollution is a risk factor for Parkinson's disease. And we're also learning so much now in the field about the effects of air pollution on birth outcomes. That is, the effects of air pollution on the fetus before the infant is even born. There's many different tools that we use to study the health effects of air pollution. And over the decades, as the research becomes better and as our tools improve, we find health effects at lower and lower concentrations. And that just keeps driving our interest to further improve air quality across the globe. Well, where do these small particles come from? They can come from power generation, like coal-fired power plants. They can come from motor vehicle exhaust, cars and trucks, from industrial emissions. And another major source, including in Central Asia, is from residential heating. And here you see chimneys from homes, and also in an area where I work in Mongolia, and this would also be relevant, say, in Kazakhstan, people living in yurts or gers, and they're burning coal inside their dwelling, and the particle emissions come out the chimney. So these are man-made sources of air pollution that are prevalent. We also have natural sources, like wildfires and suspended dust off of deserts. So these are also additional sources of air pollution, and although they're mostly larger particles, they do include some of these smaller particles too. Lastly, we're not going to talk about it today, but there are also emissions of gases, and those gases react in the atmosphere by chemistry to form particles. And that's another major source of air pollution. And in fact, in the United States, it's now perhaps the dominant source of air pollution. Is not directly emitted by the source, but rather it's formed in the atmosphere by chemistry. So it's complex. Here's just a picture of the particle and ozone monitor at the US Embassy in Tashkent. Here we can see some inlets and then the instruments. And here we see the container that holds the equipment. If you were to look at the particle measurements in more detail, it looks like the instrument on the lower left. And for context, this instrument costs about $20,000 US. The lower left happens to be an instrument we installed in Mongolia recently. And the lower right is that building in Mongolia where we installed the monitor. And you could place in this building many other gas monitors too. And I'm really excited to report that just in the last month or so, 2 of these automated stations for particles and many gases have been installed by Uzhydromet in Tashkent in collaboration with the Zamin Foundation. So we're now seeing in Uzbekistan really high quality real-time measurements of air pollution. And that's really exciting. What about the air quality in Central Asia? And here I'm showing Central Asia and South Asia. For today's discussion, let's just look at the size and the colors of the circles, which are related to how the air quality compares to that World Health Organization guideline and other targets that the World Health Organization sets. We can see these big red circles where the air pollution is the worst in South Asia. We also see some of those red circles up here in Central Asia. And while in general the air quality is a bit cleaner in Central Asia than South Asia, it's still quite polluted by international standards. And here we see Tashkent. And while Tashkent looks relatively clean compared to other Central Asian large cities, we do see that it does exceed the World Health Organization guidelines. And if it was in the United States, it would also violate the US air quality standards. So just for context, while Tashkent air quality might be relatively clean compared to other parts of Central Asia and South Asia, it's still a significant concern. Well, I showed a moment ago that ozone air pollution in Tashkent peaks in the summertime. And it turns out that particulate matter air pollution peaks in the wintertime. Here we see this is the distribution of daily values for each month. And just again, qualitatively, if we look at the features, we see the air pollution is highest in January through March and October through December. So that's another important take-home message, that the air pollution is worse for particles in the wintertime and for ozone in the summertime. And it even depends on time of day. Here's the wintertime particles in Tashkent as measured at the US Embassy in Tashkent. And we see that the lowest concentrations are actually in the middle of the day, and the highest concentrations are at night. So it's quite possible that your largest exposures to particle air pollution for those of you in Tashkent is while you sleep. And this is likely true throughout all of Central Asia. Now, here's an interesting modeling result. And I'm showing here the country of Uzbekistan. And what we see is the darker the color, the higher the level of particle air pollution. So here we can see in central Kazakhstan, it's relatively clean, although still above the World Health Organization guideline. And as we move further south, we see the air pollution levels are getting higher and higher. I also draw your attention that this is not just a Tashkent issue in Uzbekistan, but the air quality problem is throughout all of Uzbekistan, and indeed worse in southern Uzbekistan than it is in Tashkent. And the reason for this is, again, this combination of both man-made emissions and desert dust. And in southern Uzbekistan, we have a higher importance of the desert dust. One last way to look at this is, well, how many people in Uzbekistan are affected by different levels of air pollution? And I could make this graph for any country in Central Asia. The bottom graph shows the percent of the population that's exposed to different levels of air pollution. And so we see that 40% of the population is in purple, and they're exposed to relatively high levels of air pollution. Then we see about 50% is exposed to moderately high levels, and about 10% of Uzbekistan's population to relatively low levels. But again, I want to be careful. These relatively low levels are more than 2 times the World Health Organization guideline. The top is the same information, but I've now subtracted out the effect of natural sources like dust and salt. And we see there's very little in the purple. And so what this tells you is by difference, it just shows you the importance of desert dust when we're in Uzbekistan. So a question I have for you, and maybe you can post your comments in the chat of however you're watching, is where do you live in Uzbekistan or in Central Asia? And do you feel that you visually see air pollution? And if you visually see that air pollution in the wintertime, do you think it's affected by dust, or do you think your area is most affected by man-made emissions? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. So just now, to close out my comments before we open it up to a discussion, I want to talk about these indices that are used to indicate how high the air pollution levels are. In all the previous data, I've been showing the coding or the colors relative to the World Health Organization guidelines. But now I'm shifting to what we call air quality indices. And so what we see on this x-axis is the daily average particle concentration. And on the y-axis is the corresponding air quality index. So we see at really low concentrations for the pollution, the index is low, and that's in the good range. And then as we get to higher concentrations, we move up into these darker colors: moderate, unhealthy for sensitive groups. Those are vulnerable people like children or people that already have other illnesses. Unhealthy for the population in general, very unhealthy, and then hazardous. And so when you look at these maps that people show you of the air quality index, this is typically the scale that you're seeing. And then we can relate this to the different magnitude of the possible health effects. So let's close out by just taking a look at a few sources of data that you have access to. First, there's a website that shows air pollution globally. And here, this is actually from just earlier today, 3 p.m. Tashkent time, that I took this image off of a website in the same color coding that I just showed you. And what you can see is that the concentrations are relatively low and the air is relatively clean in North America and Europe. We do have some high concentrations along the coast of South America, but really what draws our attention are these high concentrations in Asia. And this is common. There's still a lot of work to be done to improve air quality in Asia. Again, this is just from 3 hours ago. If we zoom in and look at Central Asia, you have this nice set of data available to you, which includes the US Embassy data, but also other monitoring stations where the data is being reported to this database. So here's Tashkent here, and it was in the unhealthy range at 3 o'clock today. And we see some areas are cleaner, and some areas, such as here in northern Uzbekistan, are indeed were much more polluted 3 hours ago. So this is data you can access in real time. The US government has monitors in several Central Asian cities measuring particulate matter. So if you live in one of the cities I've listed here, you can get to this data by a website or from a phone app. Again, from 3 hours ago, here's the US website called Air Now. And this, I'm showing you just parts of this part of the Central Asia and a larger version, a larger scope of the world there. And I've just highlighted in this case, as an example, I clicked on the circle for Bishkek. And so we see Bishkek at that time had nice air quality. It was in the green zone, which we consider healthy. There's a phone app available with the US government air quality data called Zephyr. And at the same hour, 3 hours ago, I went into Zephyr, and here's again the Bishkek data from Kyrgyzstan. And you can again see, in this case, it was actually just a little different time. It was shifted by 1 hour, I'm sorry. And shifted by 1 hour, we now have it being here as being moderate instead of being healthy. Then lastly, there's actually nice data available for Uzbekistan. And this is data from a website that's operated by Uzhydromet. And it's in both Russian and English. I'm showing you the Russian version here. And this shows air pollution monitoring stations throughout Uzbekistan. You can access this data. Now, many of these monitoring stations are manual methods, so they're reporting data 3 times a day. But as I mentioned earlier, in Tashkent, there are now 2 automated stations reporting data every hour, such as what I'm showing here. And again, we don't care about the details, but it's reporting out many different pollutants, the small and larger particles and many gases. And you can see the real-time value on the Uzhydromet website, as well as the data over the past several hours. So this is a really nice way for you to be able to access data if you live in Uzbekistan. And Uzhydromet also has a phone app where you can access that data. It's called Air Uz. And if you were to click on any of these circles, it would then pull up for you the data that's available for that location. So in summary, I look forward to our conversation about your perspectives on air quality where you live in Central Asia. And I hope what I've convinced you of today is that there is clear evidence collected over many decades about the adverse effects of particulate matter air pollution on our health. That particulate matter air pollution is a challenge in Central Asian urban centers. And while I didn't discuss it today, it's likely also a challenge for many smaller cities and even urban and even rural areas. And in the rural areas, probably more likely southern part of Central Asia because of the dust. This particulate matter air pollution is from man-made sources and also natural sources. And I've shown you a Tashkent example, how it varies by season and time of day. So while air pollution in Central Asia is in general under monitored compared to most other, or I shouldn't say most, compared to many other locations in the world, there is growing data availability. And it's so wonderful that you can access this data in real time, as I've shown you in the last few slides. And depending on the air quality, you can take actions yourself to protect your health. So I'd like to just close out by sharing with you for just a moment a video. And this is a video of a modeling of showing the global circulation of air pollution particles. And what we have in the blue at the bottom is sea salt at the bottom and top, and you can see sea salt particles circulating the globe. The orange is really interesting. This is desert dust, in this case coming from Africa and moving westward towards the United States and towards the Caribbean. Here we can also see the desert dust from the Middle East and from China, so the Gobi and other deserts. We also have other colors like green, which is carbon. And here we see fires in the Amazon forest of South America and some fires in Africa. And note that they move around. So I show this video simply to impress upon you that the air pollution that's released locally can circulate around the globe. So right now, you're breathing your local air pollution, but you're also breathing air pollution that might have been generated in North America or even in Africa. So with that, I'll close out my comments and really would love to interact with you through the chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. That was very, very interesting. And we have some comments from our viewers answering your question about air pollution in the area where we live. So Oman Achilov is saying that dust is pretty severe in Tashkent. I believe its concentration has significantly increased the last 2-3 years with massive construction works in all parts of the city. Is there a connection with like overall a lot of construction work in the town and pollution, or is it just temporarily?
That's a great question. And it's true. We think that we even see some evidence in the US Embassy data of when there were construction activities during the summertime 2 years ago. And so, yes, construction dust in an urban area can be a major source of air pollution. And while it's only temporary during that period where you have the construction taking place on that building or that other structure or feature, my understanding is in Tashkent, as you said, there's certainly so much construction taking place right now that it's happening on a city scale. So yes, construction dust is a concern, and it is a concern for health. And there are measures that can be taken to reduce the construction dust, but it does take significant effort. Great question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aman. And also, Oman is usually can see smog in the evenings, especially along the roads where cars are concentrated.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you see that in the evening. And much like what I showed in one of my figures, that the air pollution levels are highest at night. Now, you might think that doesn't make sense because you would have most of your vehicle and industrial activities during the day. But at night, what happens is the air pollution, because of the meteorology or the weather, the air pollution stays trapped closer to ground level. So that's why you're able to see those vehicle emissions along the road more strongly at night, because they're not spreading as easily as they would during the daytime. And it's due to the weather that changes hour by hour.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So next question. I wonder, what are the possible ways to mitigate air pollution in Tashkent? What can we as regular citizens do to help combat air pollution?
There are several things, and some of them are encouraging the government to take action, of course. It's that for every city around the world, in that you can help drive the conversation about the importance of mitigating air pollution. So that's one of the things that you can do. One of the first steps is for everyone to better understand what are the sources of air pollution impacting the city. And there's good knowledge about that already, although I have not studied it yet in detail. And with now these new automated stations that Ooze Hydromet has, I think you're going to learn more about what are the sources of the air pollution in the city. Another thing that can be done is your own personal sources of air pollution. If you have a vehicle, properly maintaining that vehicle, because poorly maintained vehicles emit much more air pollution than well-maintained vehicles. Also, if you're burning materials, like if you're heating your house, if you have, say, a fireplace and you're using that to heat your house, or using it just because you like to have a fire in a fireplace, uh, do that to enjoy it, but be concerned about it on the most polluted days, where you're now adding to the problem personally on the most polluted days. So these are the types of measures you can take to mitigate air pollution. And then there are also measures you can take to protect yourself from the existing air pollution.
Thank you so much. So Pulatova Shahnoza is asking, does planting trees help to fight against CO2 emission?
Great question about CO2. So we didn't talk today about carbon dioxide, but it's a great topic because, as you know, this is the main contributor to the global warming and climate change situation, which certainly we are experiencing. And yes, planting trees can definitely help, because those trees will take up the carbon dioxide to support their growth. So it is a good strategy. It's one of many strategies to fight climate change, but it's a good one. Now, something we're also researching in my research group is whether planting trees can also help to reduce the other types of air pollution, like the particles that we were talking about today, by essentially acting as filters. And that's a story where there's currently conflicting evidence, and we hope to clarify that over the next year or two in my research group.
Thank you so much. A follow-up question about indoor pollution. Can indoor plants help us make air inside our apartment or home cleaner?
Indoor plants can serve many different purposes, and certainly they are good for you in many ways to have indoor plants. With regard to the plants removing the air pollution, it's actually a really interesting story. And what it looks like now is that it can help. And especially with regard to some types of organic gases or vapors. But it's not the plant itself taking up the air pollution. It's actually the soil and the microorganisms in the soil that can take up and consume some of those gaseous air pollutants. So it's interesting that while the plants themselves are beneficial, it might actually be the soil in which the plants are growing inside your pot, inside the house, that is equally beneficial.
Thank you. There was a question from the US Embassy in Tashkent. While you were talking, can the particles get out once they get in?
When we breathe them, yes. And so the particles, the fraction or the percent of particles that deposit in the body depends on the particle size. And where they deposit in the body also depends on the size. So there is size ranges of particles that we're interested in this PM 2.5 range, where most of them you breathe in and you exhale them right back out. However, there is a percentage of the particles that will deposit. And so over time, they will accumulate inside the lungs.
All right, thank you. We even have people joining us from Egypt today.
Great.
Hamis is wishing great success. Thank you, Hamis. So our next question is, could you please tell us about your other projects with your students?
I would love to talk about that. But first, I want to say to Hamid, it's great you're joining us from Egypt. And many years ago, I actually worked for 2 weeks in Cairo studying the air pollution problem there. So yes, with regard to the other projects in my group, I didn't show any slides, but I'll briefly mention a few of those projects. One project that I did briefly mention is our work in South Africa with medical scientists to examine whether or not air pollution, certain types of air pollution, can affect your neurological system. And we're focused on Parkinsonism, but related issues could be, say, Alzheimer's. We have work in Mongolia where we're focused on children's health. And so we've been using these low-cost sensors in over 30 kindergartens and pediatric wards of hospitals to monitor the air quality and children's exposures, and then prioritize interventions or mitigation strategies to improve the air quality in the kindergartens in those facilities. In Mongolia, we've also been measuring air quality in a smaller city, not in the capital, Ulaanbaatar, and learning that many of these smaller cities across Mongolia have air quality that's nearly as bad as the large capital, even though the population of these other cities is really small. So that's an issue that's just now being uncovered. Then lastly, some of our work in the United States. I already mentioned that we're looking at the impact of large-scale planting of trees and vegetation and how that can affect urban air quality. And we have several projects focused on measuring people's exposures to air quality. We conduct studies where we drive around cars with monitors on cars, and we can measure the air pollution and map out the air pollution in an entire neighborhood or an entire city to understand how the air pollution changes block by block, and therefore understand what people are exposed to. That's the type of work that we conduct with the students in my group.
Wow, that's very interesting. So our next question is from Dania Hasanova. She's asking, how long do the particles stay in the air?
Yeah, so it depends on their size. For those bigger particles like the dust, that they might only be in the air for a few hours. But for these smaller particles, the ones in the PM 2.5 range, they might actually be in the air for days to weeks. And that's how they're able to circulate all the way around the globe. They won't be there for months, but they will be there often for days to weeks.
Thank you. All right, so I think we covered that before, but there is a question asking what can we do to prevent pollution?
Yeah,
so,
and again, I won't repeat my answers in detail, but I'll just mention the main areas again, Gulshan. The biggest thing you can do is to be a good citizen and encourage your government to take the appropriate measures. And we know they can be expensive and we know they take time, but forward progress can be made. The other things is these personal aspects that I talked about, such as if you have a vehicle, maintaining it well, taking public transportation if it's available, especially on the most polluted days to reduce emissions if you do have a car, and thinking about your own household sources of air pollution, such as if you're burning fuels for heating.
Thank you so much. So I want to remind everyone, please take advantage of this chat and ask your questions about air quality. All right, so we have people joining us from Fergana. Hello, Gulsara. Please ask your questions. And another question from Dania. Does air pollution get worse in summer and in Central Asia because of heat?
Yeah. So the summertime air pollution problem is related to heat in that, so ozone is a gas, and as we saw in one figure, it's highest in around May, June, and July in the summertime. And what's interesting about this ground level ozone or smog, and it does tend to mostly affect your respiratory system. What's most important about it is it's not directly emitted by sources, but actually it's formed by chemistry in the atmosphere. So other chemicals are emitted. They're called nitrogen oxides and they're called volatile organic compounds. And they react in the atmosphere to form this ozone or smog. And that reaction is related to sunlight. And the sun is most intense in the middle of summer. That's why it's the warmest. Temperature itself plays a role, but it's more, the bigger issue is the intense sunlight that can drive this chemistry to take place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Shahnoza Haidarova is saying, thank you for a great presentation. How can we avoid being harmed by particles?
Yeah, there's a few different things you can do. One, of course, the long-term goal is to reduce the air pollution that you're exposed to that we discussed. And again, many actions that take time, but many actions to clean up the emission sources. In terms of your personal protection, unless you have really extreme cooking or other sources of indoor air pollution, certainly staying inside on the most polluted days can be helpful as long as your indoor air quality is better than the outdoor air quality. And that should be true on the more polluted days. That's one thing you can do. Wearing a mask on the most polluted days, most polluted particulate matter days, can also help, but only if the mask is well fitted. That's really important. Otherwise, the particles of this size can get around the edges of the mask. Another thing you can do is on the most polluted days, you might want to not exercise outdoors because that exercise, you have much more, you're breathing in much more air and you're going to be depositing many more particles. And so, of course, exercise is important, but you might not want to exercise during the peak hours of air pollution. And that's where this new hourly data from Hydromet that's available for 2 different locations in Tashkent is really helpful because you can look hour by hour when would be the best times to be outdoors.
Thank you. So it's a good thing to know that we need to upload this app on our phones and monitor air pollution in our town. Okay, so next question. What is worse, visible air pollution or invisible air pollution?
Wow. So that's a difficult one to answer. They are, let me think of the best way to answer that. So visible air pollution comes from 2 main ways. One is the resuspended dust, but the other is when you see pollution coming out of a vehicle. There, once it spreads in the atmosphere, it's no longer visible. So once you see that tailpipe, the exhaust coming from the tailpipe, maybe several tens of meters downwind, you can no longer see it. The reason why you see it when it comes out of the tailpipe is that there's so many particles next to each other that they actually affect the visibility. So the visible air pollution can be quite bad. Summertime haze because of the ozone, wintertime haze because of the particles. And those do tend to be the main pollutants that we're currently concerned about with health. But there are invisible air pollutants that we still do remain concerned about, such as carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide. And that's why I'm slow to answer this question, because they're both important, they're just different.
Okay, thank you. Is there a connection between the spread of respiratory diseases and air pollution?
Yes, there are relationships. And air pollution can affect the respiratory system in different ways. In some ways, it may cause the health effects, or it may cause the disease. In other ways, if you have the disease, it might make the disease symptoms worse. And so, yes, there's actually a really strong connection between respiratory diseases and air pollution. This is really nicely tracked if you're interested in learning about this. There is a project called the Global Burden of Disease, GBD, and it's available on the web, and it has information for every country. And at the country level, it describes the type of health impacts and broken into groups, such as impacts on your heart, impacts on your respiratory system, and including what's a particular type of impact focusing on adolescent lower respiratory disease. So it's focused on deep lung disease and its relationship to air pollution as occurs in children. So again, global burden of disease, really great resource to obtain information for any country around the world.
Thank you. Question from Arina Volkova. Is the situation with the air pollution getting better all over the world?
In some parts of the world, it's still getting worse. In most parts of the world, it is getting better. And while I don't want to necessarily highlight specific regions, I will name a few of where we think the challenges are really going to be going forward. Certainly, Africa is going to be a big challenge going forward because its population is growing so rapidly. As you may have heard, while currently most of the largest megacities are in Asia, we expect that over the next 2 to 3 decades, it will then be that most of the largest megacities are actually going to be in Africa, population-wise. Along with that explosive growth is going to be a growth in the air pollution challenge. So Africa is going to need a lot of attention. On the other side, we've seen that air quality controls have been very effective in China over the past decade. And the air quality conditions in China are improving dramatically. You then have areas like North America, the US, Canada, Europe, especially Western Europe, where the air quality has shown dramatic improvement over the last several decades. But that doesn't mean we're done. There's still more work that needs to be done to further improve air quality, even in those areas where it's relatively clean.
Thank you. Our next question is from Sayora Usabalieva. Can hybrid cars help with environment?
Yes, they can. Hybrid cars are great. So with a hybrid, you're still burning fuel at certain times, but other times the car is working off of the battery that's been charged, and it's actually recharged through part of your driving cycle, as well as plugging it into a charging station. So what happens in this case is that you are reducing the overall emissions from the vehicle directly. If you needed to plug in the vehicle to get a charge, there is still some pollution being generated at the power plant that's providing that electricity, unless you happen to have solar panels providing that electricity. However, at that power plant, because of its large scale, it's much easier to control the air pollution there. And so there's this scaling, this economy of scale, we like to say, when it comes to controlling sources. Now, while it costs a lot of money, it's easier in principle to control a single power plant than it is to control tens of thousands of vehicles with regard to emissions. So hybrids are a great option, and they're a wonderful bridge to the future of fully electric vehicles. Now, again, Unless you're getting that electricity from wind or solar or hydro, there's still emissions even with the fully electric vehicle at the power plant generating the electricity. But overall, the impact is still much, much less than burning gasoline or diesel in your car.
Okay, thank you. Why did you decide to choose air quality as your profession?
Yeah. Well, so I'm a chemical engineer by training. So in most people in my profession, they work in the area of manufacturing chemicals or petroleum, taking oil and making petroleum products like gasoline and diesel. And so all my degrees are in chemical engineering. But when I was an undergraduate student in Los Angeles, at that time in the 1990s, the air pollution problem was quite bad. And it has become much cleaner, but still polluted. But it was really bad in the 1980s. Actually, I said 90s, 1980s. The air pollution problem in Los Angeles was quite bad. And it was because I was living in Los Angeles that I was just so interested in how does this air pollution form and what can we do about it? That I started doing research as an undergraduate student in a lab studying air pollution, and it's stuck with me ever since.
Okay, thank you. Do your students make any projects to reduce air pollution?
Yes. So we have the one project where we're looking at whether or not planting trees, many, many trees on a large scale can reduce air pollution. That's one of the projects that focuses on solutions. Another project that's focusing on solutions, as I briefly mentioned, is this work in Mongolia with kindergartens. And our work there is that there are different ways that you can improve the air quality in kindergartens, or schools in general. But you first have to really know what's causing the air pollution. Is it outdoor air coming in? Is it air pollution generated within the school? And so through our work, we're identifying the sources of the air pollution, and we're looking at the building structures and whether or not they can use air purifiers, or they need to change the whole mechanical ventilation system in the building. Do they need better insulation to reduce their heating demand and things like this? So while in my group, we don't work directly on control devices for air pollution, we work on these other aspects of how to reduce air pollution exposures.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does air pollution cause damages to animals and crops?
It does. Just like how air pollution affects us as humans, it affects animals. And indeed, we can do studies that we call epidemiology studies, where we look at large populations of people and we look at health effects based on hospital admissions, death rates, and such. But there's some studies that we can't do on people, where we actually intentionally expose them to high levels of air pollution. And these tests are done on animals. And while these are typically done on, say, rats and mice, the community measures the direct effects of these air pollutants on these animals to understand how they affect people. Now, that same issue holds then for all other animals, like farm animals, your cats and your dogs. They can also be affected by air pollution too. Also, then the air pollution also affects crops and vegetation. Ozone in particular, during the summertime, it's very well documented that ozone air pollution reduces crop yield for many types of agricultural products.
Thank you. So next question. How can I naturally purify the air in my home?
Yeah. So one way to do it, again, plants can be useful for certain types of air pollutants, not all. If the main source of your air pollution is generated indoors through cooking or heating or other activities, and if the outdoors is relatively clean, periodically open your windows. That will help with both the regular air pollutants we've been talking about, as well as carbon dioxide that you and I are all emitting. If there's a lot of people in your household, those levels can build up, they can increase. So if you periodically open the windows, it'll let them out. Now, if the air pollution outside is much worse than the air pollution inside, okay, that doesn't help so much. When you open the windows, you're letting the bad air pollution in. But these are certainly using a ventilation system if you have it available while you cook. But also, lastly, things such as how you store chemicals. For example, maybe you have paint or solvents or other chemicals, and just making sure that you're storing them in a very secure area, ideally even away from the house itself, maybe in a little shed or a little structure elsewhere on your property if possible, so that they cannot evaporate and come into the rooms where people are. Lastly, indoor air purifiers, a high quality one, can also be effective to filter out these particles and some of the gases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. So looks like this was the last question. So far, we don't have any more questions, but it was such a wonderful program. We learned a lot, and it's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Turner, for doing this presentation and answering our questions today.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I really appreciate the questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about air quality during Air Quality Awareness Week.
Thank you so much. And everyone who was watching us and participating in the discussion, thanks for your wonderful questions. Please join us next week. All right, goodbye and have a good weekend.